Die Diaspora spricht.
Parlando.
Diasporas rede.
Falando. Diasporas parle.
Diaspora spreekt.
Diasporas speaking.
My name is Rina Limoni and I'm the host of Diasporas Speaking. In this podcast, together with our guests, we will explore the journeys, activism and academic developments concerning Kosovar, Albanian and Balkan diasporas to attain a deeper understanding of our communities scattered around the globe. In this episode, I will speak to Dr. Dafina Paca about her research on Kosovar-Albanian diasporas and explore how attitudes towards the diaspora are constructed in the homeland. Dr. Dafina Paca is a part-time lecturer at Cardiff University. Her teaching and research are interdisciplinary, combining cultural, social, and political theory to explore inequality in ethnicity, identity, and more recently, healthcare. Her PhD research explored the Kosovo-Albanian diaspora and constructions of identity via both the host society and homeland. Welcome to Diasporas Speaking, Dafina. Thank you so much for joining this discussion today. It is a pleasure to have the chance to chat with you about this topic.
You're very welcome, and thank you for the invitation. I'm happy to be here.
So just to break the ice, for those who have not read your research, a little bit about yourself. Where are you from in Kosovo? Where did you grow up in the UK? And because we are Diasporas Speaking, what makes you think about diasporas?
Great, thank you. So I was born in Pristina and I spent 11 years of my life there and came to the UK in 1992 with my parents. We settled in London initially for a very short period of time. My parents thought that the crisis, my dad worked in Comitet, and there was the political upheavals. And my parents thought that the crisis would resolve initially within 6 months. So they thought that they'd come to the UK, spend some time here, get the kids to maybe learn a bit of English, see the UK, and then return. And then I think their plan initially was Mas Viti 3, so after New Year. And so we came in October 92. So it was January, and then after that, it just kept getting extended to the point that there was no return, essentially. And we became British citizens a few years later. And I think my parents started accepting that they weren't going back permanently. So I grew up in London. I went to school in London. I went to university. I did my first degree at Queen Mary in English literature. And then I did my master's in research. And that was very I suppose you could say, from the perspective of a kind of nostalgic Kosovar-Albanian diasporic child who had grown up in this kind of construction of our homelands and so on. It was on the interpretation and influence of the historic figure of Skanderbeg in early modern Britain, or in fact England at the time. So I was looking at this particular publication, which was the history of Skanderbeg, published in 1596 during Elizabeth I's reign, and how that was received. It had a dedicatory sonnet by Edwin Spencer, sort of the big English poet of the time. And what I was exploring with that is why the figure of Skanderbeg was so relevant in early modern Europe. But at the same time, I think I was trying to reclaim this sort of identity for Albanians, to say we had an important role to play in the history of Europe. We would claim a Europeanness through my research. It was very ambitious, I think, for just a master's in research. But through that, I also learned a lot, developed my interest in archival research and looking at various different discourses from the past, through letters, through oral history was quite interesting to me. And then I moved to Kosovo and worked at the Kosovo Institute of Journalism and Communication. And then I applied for a scholarship to do my PhD at Cardiff University, because at the time Cardiff University taught into the programme. And I wanted to do it I had changed at this point. I wanted to look at the way in which the diasporic identity of Kosovar-Albanians is constructed in the UK. But I was also very much interested in how the diaspora is constructed by the homeland, by those who live and who remain. And I had noticed the negative discourses by living in Kosovo about, the first time I heard the term shatti, which has sort of inspired me to think about it a bit more and explore it a bit more. And then all sorts of other constructions that were happening linguistically, people just talking about it, but also media representations and other parts of society, and sort of that kind of looking at it. And I was interested in almost the kind of, I'm not quite sure how to best describe it, but that identity that forms through those interactions and that cultural kind of milieu, as it were, especially in the summer when diaspora from other places around the world were coming back to Kosovo. So I came to Cardiff and did my PhD and did my research, became interested in other things as well in terms of that research, and kind of tried to move it forward. And I sort of still intend to do a bit more, having done this work, which was very significant, I feel, in bringing into light some of the discriminatory discourses around diaspora. Now I'm a graduate entry medical student in my third year, which is something that happened after lockdown. But in terms of my research, there's still a focus in identity construction, and also I'm quite interested in how diaspora then construct their identities in relation to the negative identities that they have been constructed into. So is there a kind of resistance? Is there subversion? Is there other kinds of things going on? Or is there an attempt to try and justify your existence, to try and sanitize it, to try and claim it back, and so on?
You just mentioned your research, which, among others, explores how diasporas are perceived in their country of origin. You wrote a particular paper on this, on the shatti discourse. What's in the word? Who is a shatti and who is not a shatti? And what is meant by the designation?
So, I mean, in the paper, what you'll find is that the shatti discourse is very much constructed by the homeland Kosovar-Albanians, right? I mean, it comes from this idea that it's a subversion of the term, and it gets subverted further, but the term itself is a German word that is often used to designate a kind of relation, a familial relationship between people in a similar vein to the English, let's say, honey or darling or love or whatever. It's a term of endearment, and it was heard quite often in usage by those who went back from various German-speaking countries to Kosovo, and I guess they were using it within their own kind of familial circles, families going back to Kosovo, speaking to their kids, their parents, and so on, who were German-speaking. And the Kosovo-Albanians in Kosovo were hearing this and started to subvert it, to refer to them as such shatti, but not in a positive way, as a pejorative term, to kind of describe them as the diaspora, specifically from the German-speaking countries where it's used. And then I heard it, and I did the researcher thing where I did interviews and tried to decide, kind of to get the information from people to see what it actually meant. And then it became quite clear that it was a very interesting discursive construction, and it was very clear and identifiable. It was very almost tangible in a sense, because people were very much able to tell you what a shatti was and who they were and what they looked like and so on. So in the imaginary of the homeland, it was a very clear-cut construction, and it was a stereotype.
The conversation around the so-constructed shattis is often very shallow, superficial, concentrated on the visual portrayals of individuals. I myself grew up in the German diaspora and then came to the UK to study. And when I came here, something that was so vivid and glaring, this split, almost a hierarchy between the diasporas, where the Kosovo-Albanian diaspora in Germany was perceived as backward. Do you think the shatti discourse has a local history, considering attitudes in the qytet-katon dichotomy for the English-speaking audience between village and city, or urban and rural?
Yes, so that was exactly it. So further on, I moved on from that, and so in that very paper, I talk about that urban-rural divide, and the idea of a qytetar and katonar, that's where it stems from, because most of the workers who went to Germany were described as gastarbeiters or guest workers, and so the idea that they came from relatively poor economic backgrounds, from rural areas where they didn't have opportunities in Kosovo, so they went to seek them in Germany, essentially. And then you have the British, there were Kosovans who went to the UK, who often claimed political asylum, and there were political reasons, and there was a political kind of trajectory, or at least an urban one anyway. And if you come from Kosovo at the time in the 90s from an urban background where you were employed in some form within the structures, that discrimination, being sacked from work for being an Albanian and so on, that's very much part of that identity and part of that kind of background of your political asylum and your identity within the UK context. So I think there is this idea that the UK diaspora constructed itself against the German Gastarbeiter diaspora. And I think from my research and everything that there is also elements of how the UK positions itself in relation to the EU as well, and the German-speaking world, where the UK tends to construct itself as more sophisticated, and so that replicates and mirrors and parallels to those discourses and so on. So I'm not surprised that you encountered a negative construction of people coming from Germany. I'm assuming that's what you're referring to.
Yes.
As a Kosovo-Albanian, this idea that, you probably come from a rural background that is somehow worse, that is less educated, less refined, and therefore, there's discrimination. For me, anyway, I don't think people who construct this duality think of it as discrimination, but for me, it is definitely a discriminatory discourse. It's a politics of identity in many ways.
You just touched upon the UK diaspora, as I mentioned at this point, but beyond this dichotomy, what do you think could explain these attitudes? It is because, as we also spoke in our previous conversation, because Kosovar-Albanian diasporas in the UK speak English, and the English language is more accessible, also because pop culture and otherwise being consumed before moving to the UK or English-speaking countries.
I think all those factors contribute. I think that the divisions within the sort of Kosovan society post-war, with the international community's presence and the fact that the international community, there was like a class system almost established based on the presence of the international community in Kosovo at the time, where an English dominated as well. That possibly speaking English, being from the UK, there were lots of people who went back from the UK to Kosovo during that period who were able to get very successful, high-paying jobs and so on. I think all these things contributed to it. I think that you are correct that the fact that a lot of culture that is consumed internationally is dominated by English, and English-speaking countries, the US as well, means that it's probably kind of more ubiquitous. And therefore, I'm not sure whether the constructions from the homeland are entirely based on those encounters pre even migration with Western kind of English-speaking communities, or when I say communities or culture, like watching TV and so on. I'm not sure entirely, but I definitely think that the entrenched ideas around and divisions, because although you could argue on one level that post-Second World War with communism and the sort of drive for education for everyone and so on, you had a kind of more equalized, if that is even a term, society in Kosovo. I think that in actual fact, the same structures that pre-existed, those same divisions, the stark kind of urban-rural division replicated itself and continue to do so. And privilege is pretty important in this, because a lot of the diaspora that went to London were more privileged than the ones that sort of went to, as I said, Germany. And I think that is a replication of pre-existing notions. There were communities in Kosovo that were urban elites post the Ottoman period, who referred to people who were from, who only spoke Turkish, and referred to people who were from rural areas, as not even Katanar, but as Shqiptar. Therefore, if you were Shqiptar, you were from. So if you're an Albanian, in effect, you were from the villages and not the towns where Turkish was spoken. And in some ways, perhaps that replication with the international community and English dominating post-war, the sort of you went from I think there was a period also where Serbian was spoken as well. So there's the Ottoman Empire, you have Turkish as the urban elite language. You move that during Yugoslavia, you get the urban elite also being able to speak Serbo-Croat very well and not be distinguished from and that was a kind of kudos and a capital, a cultural and social capital. And then that got transferred to with the international community. Again, you got this cultural and social sort of capital from a sort of big Bourdieuian sense that got transferred. So you have this in the society.
Po dolin jashtë, po mendoj se perëndimi ton admirat i ka në të dit. E ku bakçia tu i punu, te dje shkollë si ka nuk din miras me shku as me ledzu kur t'vin mas 4-5 vete. Ja nisim me na shqit me, kishe shpejt po mërzitën se nuk por vinjet në këtë bandi. Bën 4-5 marka edhe e blejn një ker. Hypin ton, vinte na edhe shqitën frajere. Na këtu tu i kry, zisam dhët një fakultet. Ta duhet mingu gyrbe gjit që është në perëndim jeta. Pse kanë fare, mendoj se janë ma t'meqëm se ty hyn lugave në politik. Në me këtë dhe unë diçka po ti edhe kanë marë. Kultur perëndimore, pritojnë me t'vojt për dore. T'ja bojnë si Gjermani, e t'vite ma shtucin perëndim. Se kështu me t'vojt për dore, po më doket pa kuptime. Ata po vazhdojnë dhe në të njëjtën mirë po jetojnë. Edhe tanë pohën, po knojnë.
Aman, Gjermani, e shkëtar Gjermani, më mashtrove mëri, që të kam gjithë pas.
E vërteta është kjo.
Aman, Gjermani, ma e mira Gjermani, më gësove nëri, duke më dhën pasuri.
And one point which you mentioned in our last conversation, which is curious to explore, in addition to the international community being in Kosovo and contributing towards the formation of a class in the capital, you also mentioned how Britain's position historically, its imperial position, plays a role, how the UK diaspora perceives themselves and how they are perceived.
The thing is, the UK, I mean, I think we had this conversation, I think we briefly touched upon it. I don't know if it was, I think we said, that look, if you look at Germany, it has some of the top universities in the world, right? But most people will only be able to name you Oxford and Cambridge if you ask them about universities outside of Harvard, potentially. And now not many people will know about universities in Germany. And I'm not just saying people in Kosovo, I'm talking in general, in the UK as well. So in terms of representations, also in terms of media representation and so on, we know much more about the culture and the lives, or at least in sort of media representations of those living in English-speaking world, right? So from the perspective of UK is, got that legacy of empire. It is its way to construct itself in relation to Europe as well, which is, you could argue why people voted Brexit as well. Because it's not that they didn't feel European in the sense that they weren't European. It is that they feel that they're more superior European. And therefore, they cannot possibly be with the rest, especially with the EU expansion to include others in Europe that they do not identify with. So yes, all these elements have an impact and your cultural capital gained in the UK has an importance in Kosovo. So if you went to the UK and you did well, then you have much more of an importance in Kosovo than if you didn't. But further, it's interesting because the way in which that capital kind of multiplies, isn't it? That there is also this anxiety by those who are in the UK, who've done things in the UK, who've perhaps achieved things and so on, to justify their achievement in Kosovo and sort of almost say that, this is not because I moved to the UK. This is because I would have been successful anyway. Because there's a kind of discourse that, well, these people wouldn't have been able to make it if they were in Kosovo by the Kosovans. It's only because they went to the UK that they were enabled to achieve, because in the UK, there's an element of credit going towards the UK rather than the individuals themselves. So I think that's also interesting. I think that if some of the work that I've done around what I call prosthetic memories is that a lot of the trajectory of migration starts to become about the way in which you want to be perceived as the ideal migrant and your history. And it's very much kind of constructed along the lines of, well, I'm from here, this is what my background was, and this is what I've achieved here, and so on and so forth, because that's a sort of move towards rejecting any type of discourse coming from Kosovo that suggests that people who move to the UK or any other place, but this is more of a sort of a pushback from the UK diaspora, that they perhaps didn't have as nice a life as they claim to, or something like that, So, yeah.
Speaking to you now, one sees how much text goes missing in this debates. But something that has been changing as well is how, for instance, through the prominence and, so to speak, the attainment of certain authority internationally from Kosovar-Albanian football players in Switzerland, how then this prominence, the narrative is shifting to some degree.
So the football players from Switzerland and Germany definitely changed the dynamics, and they sort of sensibilitized, essentially, if I can say that, this sort of overt Albanianness that was associated with the German-speaking diaspora. This idea that you go to Germany or Switzerland, you live there for 30 years and you still retain your Albanianness from this village back in the 80s in some rural area. And actually what those football players did is say, yeah, cool about it. And look, we're going to walk around making the sign of the double-headed eagle. And that's actually not a cringy thing to do. Whereas before it would have been seen as kind of that sort of nationalistic to the state, to the level of the state. By state I mean level, that it crosses over into it being kind of abject and a bit cringy and a bit too much. But they managed to change that perception quite substantially, and you see the uber cool London and the Kosovo-Albanian diaspora now embracing it as well. But only in certain occasions, obviously. It cannot be embraced all the time. It can only be embraced when there's football games on. It mustn't be embraced at other times because, they've got an image to maintain.
And this brings me to the next point, perhaps to a new way, if we can say so, of the Kosovo diaspora migrating to Germany mainly. These are individuals that usually arrive with language skills, diplomas, and most of the time also a place of work. And though research has not been conducted on this, how do you think will this impact on how diasporas are perceived in Kosovo?
Partially depends on, I think a lot of this also partially depends on, I think I mentioned it before, that partially the way you're constructed by the homeland diaspora is also based on how you are treated by the host society. So Germany did have a long history of discriminating its diasporas. It's kind of from, the Turkish diaspora onwards, right? And I think that the way in which you are treated by the host society has an impact on how you are then also seen by the homeland, because let's not forget that there was a period in which the British press wrote very negatively about Kosovo-Albanians and Albanians, which reflected again in terms of this information, this media is consumed in Kosovo, which also impacted in discourses in Kosovo. So I think it is going to depend on how they're treated and how they're incorporated in society, in the host society. But I feel that, and the research hasn't been done yet, so no, I haven't done any research. I hope somebody else will, and go and interview people and find out how they perceive those people who've gone to Germany now with jobs and careers and so on. But I have a feeling that some of the remnants of those constructions, of those stereotypes will remain. So I think that I'm hoping it will it won't, but I have a suspicion that it might. These are quite entrenched, and the reason why they're entrenched is because it's about trying to position yourself in relation to others. And for those who remain, it is a way of claiming some agency, some value in their own identities, which, you know, if they're relying on income from people who've moved, who are sending remittances, which has kind of been the case with diaspora for a long time, they may have to kind of find other ways of getting some kind of self-worth. And sometimes, unfortunately, people have this ability to try and put others down in order to make themselves feel better, almost, you know. I mean, I'm not saying that some of the stereotypes are not, you know, they're not based on some kind of factual experience, encounter, whatever. But yeah, I don't know. I don't know is my answer. Is I don't know. I don't know how they're going to be perceived, but I have a feeling that it all depends on how they will be treated in the host society.
Unfortunately, Germany has the skill to produce migrants as others continuously, whether one is a PhD student, a doctor who created life-saving vaccine, or born there. But we're nearing the end of this conversation, and a question I ask most of my guests in this podcast is, if you could bring one thing from Kosovo to the diaspora, the UK, on this occasion, what would it be?
I think I said something about the society being a lot more straightforward at times, but a lot more speaking their minds. And I think that sometimes, yeah, that is quite a good thing. And it can be a bit kind of, you can, if you've spent far too long in the UK, you can be a bit like, oh wow, did you just say that? But on another level, it can actually, you know, that sometimes that's what you're dealing with. People will express their minds. And I sometimes, yeah, do miss that. I miss people's ability to express themselves freely. And kind of there's more, I feel like there's more of kind of people saying what they mean. And sometimes I miss that because I spent quite a bit of time in Kosovo. Spent having returned and kind of spent time working there. So I spent quite a long time. So yeah, I do miss it. I miss quite a few things, like being able to go down, you know, town for coffee and meet friends and so on, and have that time. I think we all talked about that last time, that you know, time is relative, but there seems to be more time in Kosovo than there does in other places. So we kind of I feel that, yeah, I'd like that. I'd like to be able to have that here. Yeah, and I think that I think my final thing would be what I quite like is just how people are well versed in politics and political struggles and political ideology. I think that's quite interesting in Kosovo, that you don't find elsewhere, that people are very young people especially are very well versed. But now I'm going off on one.
Thank you so much. That is a beautiful ending to this conversation. And thank you, Dafina, for sharing your insights and research with the audience of Diasporas Speaking. It was a pleasure hosting you today.
No worries. I hope it was useful. If you ever need to talk more, I'm more than happy to do so.